I was 7 months into my third pregnancy when I asked my mother-in-law if I could sit down for the afternoon, and I watched her face do something I had never seen it do before. It did not go angry, it went still, the way a pond goes still right before the first hard frost sets into it overnight. She had a basin of green beans in her lap, and she kept snapping them, one after another, while she looked at me like I had asked her something in a language she had decided not to understand. "Sit," she said finally, "and see how far sitting gets you." Then she went back to the beans. I stood in that kitchen with my hand pressed flat against the underside of my belly, feeling the baby turn, and I understood that I had just done something wrong, though no one would tell me what exactly until much later. I was 23 years old. My name is Naomi. This is the Amish Wife, the channel where hidden Amish wife stories are told from the inside. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, married at 19, and I left at 25. If you are new here, I want to say the thing I say at the start of every video, because it is still true every single time. I read every comment you leave me. Everyone. So before I go further, I want to ask you something, because it is at the center of this story. Were you ever taught, in ways no one ever said out loud, that a woman's body belongs to her work before it belongs to her? If that question lands somewhere in you, I would love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Now subscribe, hit the bell, and let's go back to that kitchen, because there is more to tell you about why sitting down was the wrong thing to do. In the outside world, a pregnant woman is told to rest. Doctors say it, magazines say it, even strangers on the street will tell a woman with a swollen belly to put her feet up. In my community, rest was not something a body earned by being pregnant. It was something a body earned by finishing. The garden did not know you were carrying a child. The wash line did not know. The 8 other mouths at the table did not know, and if they did, it did not change how hungry they were. There is a phrase we did not say directly, but that lived underneath everything. The way certain load-bearing walls hold up a house without anyone ever pointing at them and calling them by name. A woman's labor does not stop for the labor that is coming. Pregnancy was treated the way weather was treated. Something happening to you certainly, but not something that excused you from anything. Rest, especially requested rest, especially rest asked for out loud, was quietly filed under Hochmut, pride. As if a body announcing its own tiredness were a body setting itself above the work God had given it to do. I met my husband Samuel at a school benefit auction the autumn I turned 17. He was quiet in the particular way that Amish men are trained to be quiet, not sullen, just economical, saving his words the way his father saved twine. We married 2 years later on a Thursday in late October, 300 guests, 4 hours of preaching before we ate, roast chicken and creamed celery, and 7 kinds of pie laid out on tables that stretched the length of his father's shop floor. I want to be careful here, because it matters. Samuel was not a cruel man. He never raised a hand to me. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, taught by his own father that a wife's exhaustion was a private weather system he was not responsible for managing. Our first daughter came within the year. Our second came 14 months after that. By the time I was pregnant with our third, I had learned to move through my days the way you move through a house you know so well you no longer need the lights on. The trigger, when it came, was almost embarrassingly small. I had been up twice in the night with our younger daughter's teething, and by mid-morning, the ground under me had started to feel less like ground, and more like something I was walking across rather than standing on. I sat down at the kitchen table for perhaps 20 minutes while the bread rose, and Samuel's mother, who had come to help with canning, found me there with my eyes closed and my hands resting on my belly. That was the moment, not the sitting itself. Women sat, briefly, all the time, the way you might lean against a doorframe. But the 20 minutes of it, unapologized for, unexplained, in the middle of a morning that still had beans to snap and jars to seal. I had let my body ask for something without first negotiating for it. That was the part that could not be forgiven quietly. For 3 days after that, Samuel did not raise his voice at me, because he never did, but he also did not speak to me beyond what the household required. Pass the salt, the horse needs water. I did not understand yet that this silence was the first tier of something larger, something with its own architecture, built long before either of us was born. I only knew that the kitchen felt 10 degrees colder than the thermometer on the porch said it was. On the 4th day, my own mother came to visit, ostensibly to see how the canning had gone, and she sat across from me at the table, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she did not drink from. "A woman who lies down in the middle of the field," she said, not looking at me. should not be surprised when the weeds get ahead of her. I said nothing. I had learned, the way Amish women always learn things, quietly, sideways, that this was not really about weeds. That evening, though, something shifted, and I want to tell you about it honestly, because it confused me for a long time afterward. Samuel came in from the barn holding a choufle pie he had asked his sister to make, my favorite, still warm, and he set it on the table and said my name softly, the way he used to say it when we were courting. He asked how I was feeling. He rubbed my lower back while I stood at the sink. For one evening, the cold lifted entirely, and I remember lying in bed that night, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing, if the chill of the previous 3 days had simply been my own tiredness playing tricks on me. I would understand much later that this was not an accident and not tenderness returning on its own schedule. It was a pattern as old as the community itself. The warmth comes back just long enough to make you doubt what the cold had told you. The next morning, my sister-in-law Rebecca stopped by with a jar of chow chow she didn't need to deliver in person, and over coffee she mentioned, almost as an aside, that her own mother had once had trouble with her 4th pregnancy, trouble she would not name specifically, her eyes sliding toward the window instead of toward me. She rested for it, Rebecca said, and folks still talk about that summer. I asked what kind of trouble. Rebecca's hands kept moving, wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. It does not have an official name, she said, but it exists, the way a lot of things in our life exist. Everyone knows. No one says. Then she changed the subject to the price of chicken feed, and I understood the conversation was over. It was 2 days later that the bishop's wife arrived, unannounced, with a coffee cake still warm from her own oven, and sat in my front room asking after my health in a voice so gentle it took me nearly the whole visit to understand that I was being managed. "We would hate for anyone to think you were too proud to carry your share," she said, smiling, cutting the cake herself. "Pride puts a heavier load on a body than any pregnancy does." I nodded and thanked her for the cake. I did not eat any of it that day. It was at the quilting frame 2 weeks later that I got the sentence that changed how I understood everything. Lydia was 71 that year, half deaf, famous in our district for saying almost nothing at these gatherings except what needed saying about thread tension. She was seated beside me, threading a needle without looking up, when she said, in a voice pitched only for me, "They do not tell a pregnant woman to stop. That is not our way. What they do is harder." I asked her what she meant. She did not look at me. "I lost one at the end," she said. "In my 4th month of carrying, the summer I was made to finish the 2nd cutting of hay alone, because my husband's back was bad and no one else could be spared. Nobody called it anything. It did not have a name. It just happened, the way things happen to women who asked for nothing." She tied off her thread and moved to the next square of the quilt, and that was the end of it. She never brought it up again, not once, in all the years I knew her after. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. I know these stories are not easy to sit with, and I promise you they are harder to tell than they are to hear. If any part of this is resonating with you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because there is a great deal more I have not yet said, and I would hate for you to miss where this goes. Now, back to that summer. Lydia's words did something to me that I could not undo. I began noticing, in the weeks that followed, how many women in our district had a story like hers folded somewhere inside them. An aunt who was never quite right after her 6th child, a cousin who disappeared to a relative's farm in another state for what was called a rest cure, and came back thinner and quieter than she left. I had grown up believing my own tiredness was a private failing. I began to understand it as the inherited weather system, passed down mother to daughter, the way a quilt pattern is passed down, except this pattern was made of exhaustion instead of thread. The reversal came at my own mother's kitchen table, of all places, on an ordinary Tuesday. I had gone to ask her carefully whether she remembered ever being told to rest during her own pregnancies, half hoping she would tell me it had been different for her generation. Instead, she looked at me for a long moment and said quietly, "I asked once. Your father's mother told me a wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes. I never asked again." I sat with that sentence for what felt like a very long time. My mother had not been protecting the tradition from a place of ignorance. She had been protecting me from a cost she already knew, because she had already paid it herself, decades before I was born, and had simply decided the payment was the price of belonging. That was the moment the story stopped being about Samuel, or his mother, or even the bishop's wife. It was older than all of them. It was a system, and every woman in it had been both harmed by it and, in her own quiet way, complicit in keeping it standing. I carried that 3rd pregnancy to term without asking for rest again. I want to tell you that nothing happened, that I was simply tired and nothing more, and mostly that was true. But there was a week near the end, in my 9th month, when I bled lightly for 2 days and told no one but Samuel, who told me to lie down, quietly, without telling his mother, and I understood in that private kindness both how much he loved me and how little that love could actually protect me from the architecture we both lived inside. The bleeding stopped. The baby, our son, was born healthy in November, in a room lit by a kerosene lamp burning low, and everyone said what a blessing it was, and no one asked what those 2 days in my 9th month had cost me to carry alone. It was after that birth, lying in bed with a newborn against my chest, and my body still aching in ways no one had prepared me for, that the decision arrived, not loudly, not as an argument, but the way you know a season has changed before the calendar tells you so. I was watching snow start on the fields outside my window, the first snow of that November, and I thought about Lydia's needle moving steadily through the fabric while she told me the hardest thing she had ever told anyone. I thought about my mother's coffee cup she never drank from. I thought about the 20 minutes I had sat at that table with my eyes closed, and how much of my life since then had been an apology for those 20 minutes. I did not decide, in that moment, to leave everything. I only decided that I would not teach my daughters that their bodies were currency to be spent down to nothing before anyone would call them tired. It took nearly 2 more years before I acted on that decision, because deciding clarity and having the means to walk toward it are 2 very different things. I had 3 children by then, no cash beyond what I had saved a few dollars at a time from selling eggs at the end of our lane, and a community that watched more closely after any hint of dissatisfaction. There was a final obstacle I have to tell you about honestly. My own father grew ill that winter, and for a while I set the whole question aside, because I could not imagine leaving while he might be dying, and some nights I told myself I had imagined the whole weight of what I had been carrying. That was its own kind of false relief, the year's delay disguised as devotion. He recovered, slowly, and once he did, I understood that I had been given the postponement I needed, not the escape I had let myself hope for. I will not tell you the whole story of the leaving today, because it belongs to a different video, but I will tell you it involved 1 suitcase, a ride arranged through a Mennonite woman in town who had helped other women before me and asked for nothing but the truth about where I was going, and egg money I had folded into the lining of a coat for 2 years before I ever spent a cent of it. What came after was its own education. Letters I sent home came back unopened, the flap unbroken, my own handwriting staring back at me from the mailbox like an accusation. My mother's face, the one time I saw her in town afterward, went through the window of a car like I was made of glass rather than flesh, and I understood then that I had become, to her, a kind of grief she had decided not to feel out loud. Even now, years later, there is a particular echo that still catches me off guard. I sometimes stand in a store with something small in my hands, a candle, a bar of good soap, something that costs almost nothing, and I feel my whole body brace, waiting for someone to tell me I have not earned it yet. A therapist I began seeing, a small, patient English woman with reading glasses she was always misplacing, and a row of plants along her windowsill, gave me words I had never been permitted before. She called it coercive control. She told me that consent given because the cost of refusal has been made unbearable is not really consent at all, no matter how quietly it is extracted. She said something I have never forgotten. The most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. I sat in her office the first time she said that and cried in a way I had not let myself cry since I was a girl, because it was the first time anyone had told me that my exhaustion had not been a character flaw. It had been the intended outcome of a very old design. I want to be careful here, the way I always try to be careful. I do not hate the Amish. My husband was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, handed a script before he ever had the chance to question whether he wanted the part. The system is the thing, not the people caught inside it. That community also gave me a work ethic I still rely on every day, a capacity for faith I have not entirely set down, and sisters, in blood and otherwise, whom I still love even from this distance. I do not tell these stories to tear down what raised me. I tell them so that the next woman standing at that kitchen table with her eyes closed knows there is a name for what is happening to her. If you grew up in a place where your body was treated as a resource to be managed, rather than a life to be lived, I see you. If you ever sat down for 20 minutes and felt the temperature of an entire room change because of it, I see you. If you were ever told that rest was pride, and pride was the one sin a good woman could never be forgiven, I see you. You were not lazy. You were not proud. You were a body that had been working a long time, asking for something every living thing is owed, and you were taught to apologize for the asking. That was never a fair trade, and it was never your fault. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me your story too, if you're ready. I read every single one. Subscribe to The Amish Wife, because there is so much more I have not yet said. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your body is yours. It was yours before you carried anyone else's.